Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Stephen Bailey, Assistant Director of Transportation and Public Works. With me are Ronnie Katrib, our Engineering Administrator, Daniel Sizemore, our Bike Ped and Safety Coordinator, and Jared Draper, one of our consultants with the Tool Design Group. This video presentation will cover a number of concepts for the upcoming Barber Street Bicycle and Pedestrian Improvement Project. This will be a high-level overview for the sake of your viewing time, but we will also be directing you to more in-depth content as well. We're recording this as part of our online public outreach program. At the end of this presentation, we'll provide a number of ways for you, the viewer, to make comments, ask questions, and give valuable feedback to share with Mayor and Commission as they choose a preferred concept during their upcoming voting session in June. Next slide. We'll talk you through some background, do some cost-benefit analysis, and show you the staff-preferred concept with probable costs and how that affects the overall Athens in Motion funding strategy with our existing budgets. I'll talk briefly about this history of this project, and then our Bike Ped coordinator, Daniel Sizemore, will put this into context as part of the greater surrounding Bike Ped network. Then Jared will talk you through the conceptual design. And finally, Ronnie and Daniel will explain next steps and walk you through the online story map where you can find additional information, including a PDF copy of this presentation and an interactive survey tool. Next slide. And one more. All right, so the Athens in Motion Bicycle and Pedestrian Master Plan was a result of years-long discussions about how to prioritize, expand, and promote bicycle and pedestrian networks here in Athens. It's given us a framework and prioritized project list to start this build-out. It's also led to the creation of the Bike Ped and Safety Coordinator position, as well as the community-led Athens in Motion Commission. In February of 2021, the Athens in Motion Commission reviewed alternatives for Barber Street, and in March, they voted to recommend the preferred alternative that we'll be exploring during this video. Next slide. Later in March, the Mayor and Commission reviewed the same alternatives for Barber during an online work session and directed staff to consider further options, including lane reductions, alternative sidewalk placement, costing out multi-use paths versus separate bike and ped facilities, and further development of a concept for the area of Barber between Prince Avenue and Boulevard, known here as Segment 4. Next slide. So once staff had done so, the Athens in Motion Commission reconvened for a final recommendation vote, agreeing with the potential for lane reductions and maintaining the recommendation that the majority of the project keep a two-way separated bike facility with adjacent sidewalks, while the Prince to Boulevard segment maintain existing sidewalks and share the road signage and curb bump outs for on-road bicycle travel. As funding may be limited, they also stated their prioritization for funds with the segments closer to Prince being the highest priority for building out first. Next slide. So Barber was the last project to get an on-site walk audit before the pandemic hit. We had 10 people join that walk. Comments from the audit were positive in favor of multi-use facilities, with comments focused on the safety concerns listed here, and also some beautification recommendations throughout the corridor. And now I'm going to turn it over to Daniel, who will give you some context for this project as it relates to other current or proposed pieces of the network nearby. Daniel?
Thanks, Stephen. So with this map, you can see that we have several funded and potentially future funded projects shown on this map. Starting up here on the northern area, we've got Vincent Drive Sidewalks, which is funded through SPLOST 2020. This is going to require a complete streets analysis, and we will be looking at the possibility of multi-use path comparison in the future when we get to that. You can also see over here where the Jefferson River Road multi-use path project is. That was part of an earlier phase of this T-SPLOST project. You can also see that we have Chase Street Bike and Pedestrian Facilities, preliminary engineering. This is funded through a Georgia Department of Transportation TAP grant, where we are matching 20% of our funds to go towards 80% of theirs. And this is essentially from the railroad going all the way up to Newton Bridge Road. Other projects that exist within this area, we've got tax allocation districts, which is an important consideration. That is all outlined in pink. And then we also have these unfunded projects along Boulevard and south from Barber Street. Those are both within the Athens in Motion plan as Tier 1 projects. And then you can also see that we have the existing Greenway network shown here, and there are some future Greenway trails that are within this area that will connect to this network. For the sections that we could not fund with TAD, then those would also make a good T-SPLOST proposal. So. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Jared.
All right. So speaking of the Athens in Motion plan, obviously Barber Street had a number of Tier 1 projects when we're thinking about between North Chase, Dairy Pack, and Prince Avenue. You can see that Barber Street, as part of those recommendations, fell into the urban context, which recommended a separated bikeway. This could be a number of things, including a kind of separated bike lane or a multi-use path. And we'll look at some of those alternatives here shortly. If you can go to the next slide. During the Athens in Motion plan, the Chase Street corridor study was also conducted. Really, the focus of the Chase Street corridor study was to identify a preferred bicycle and pedestrian connection between Prince Avenue and Newton Bridge Road. During that corridor study, it was really determined that Barber Street, due to the fact that it didn't have to pass through an active interchange of Loop 10, was really the preferred corridor or alignment for that bicycle and pedestrian connection between these two destinations within the community. If you'll go to the next slide. On the following slides, we're going to look at a little bit of the trade-offs and the alternatives that were studied as part of this work for Barber Street. If you'll go to the next slide. As Stephen already mentioned, you can see there's a number of different segments. Segment 1, starting to at the north, is the Dairy Pack Road, North Chase Street to Loop 10. It's really where there's a transition and what the roadway looks like today. Segment 2, from Loop 10 to the Oneida and Waterworks intersection. Segment 3, from Oneida and Waterworks to Boulevard. And then finally, segment 4, from Boulevard to Prince Avenue. If you'll go to the next slide. As part of this analysis, we looked at a number of different trade-offs. A decision matrix was created to really analyze every single possible solution. Each one of the icons here represent a number of things. You can see there are some things that really impact the cost when it comes to construction maintenance. As far as categories, you can think about right-of-way acquisition, utility relocation, where existing curbs already are or where they can be retained, and then other things that impact the comfort of a user, whether you're a pedestrian, if there's a pedestrian facility, or if you are a bicyclist. And so you can see things like the continuous facilities, separations of modes, and then the presence of trees. If you go to the next slide. As part of this work, we actually reviewed 20 alternatives. They were evaluated for each one for overall the segments, as well as the 3 intersections, and those intersections being North Chase, Dairy Pack, Oneida Waterworks, as well as Boulevard. Each one of the trade-offs and every single one of the alternatives really kind of gave a illustration of what the impacts were when it came to cost, as well as the comfort for users along that segment or that alternative. You go to the next slide. The findings from the analysis or the evaluation was that ultimately a 2-way separated bike lane with a separate sidewalk offered a lot of comfort for users without creating a very large footprint or additional space that's needed. It really could be the best option for creating a continuous facility along the entire corridor, but obviously there were impacts for utilities where relocation of specific utilities and power poles may be required. We also recognize that there are other constraints along this corridor. And so when we were looking at certain facilities, bicycle and pedestrian, the change in the footprint really was something that was considered for during the evaluation. And then finally, we needed to make sure that the travel lanes, we kept a minimum width, and therefore we need to constrain the separated bikeway at certain points to make sure that we allowed for certain vehicles, specifically buses, as well as trucks, and depending on the corridor. You go to the next slide. Over the next few slides, I'm going to cover the preferred design as well as some of the cost associated. If you go to the next slide, you can see at a high level some of the right-of-way impacts that may exist along the corridor. These are really just highlighting the number of parcels, but not necessarily what the extent of that impact would be. If you'll go to the next slide, in many cases that impact is fairly minimal. The opinion of probable cost is broken down for every single one of the segments, as well as the 3 intersections, so that you can see them individually. While the costs are preliminary, they have been refined and include a number of things, so we feel really good about the numbers moving forward. And you will also note that the Athens in Motion Commission recommendations are noted for the segments, but there are a few alternatives that are going to be highlighted. So if you go to the next slide, we'll start to the north at the intersection of Dairy Pack, North Chase, Barber Street, and Newton Bridge. For every one of these alternatives, you'll see a detailed cost, as well as there will be a summary later. Here you can see that the shared use path crossings, there would be a transition to the separated bike lanes. And then also it formalizes crosswalks, shortening some of those crossing distances and providing appropriate truck aprons to make sure that larger vehicles can make the turns as necessary. Next slide. Segment 1, there will be 2 alternatives. First is the Athens in Motion recommendation. You can see here, this narrows the street from 4 lanes to 3 and repurposes the outside, the 4th lane, for a 2-way separated bike lane that would be separated both horizontally as well as with a vertical element such as a curb shown here from those vehicular lanes. There would be an attached sidewalk that, again, pedestrians would have their own space. If you go to the next slide. The plan view of this shows how that new cross section would look on the street. You can see the 3 lanes for travel, as well as that on-street 2-way separated bike lane and attached sidewalk that would transition as we move south to segment 2. Next slide. However, segment 1 does have an alternative. This is what it would look like to maintain the 4 lanes and then actually separate that 2-way separated bike lane and sidewalk outside of the existing travel way. And so you can see here and on the next slide how the plan view really pulls that out from traffic. However, it does not repurpose that travel lane and requires, even though it may not require additional right-of-way, because the right-of-way here is pretty wide, it does impact some of the driveway crossings in a little bit different way than the repurposing of the 4th lane. To go to the next slide. Segment 2 from the loop to Oneida Street, you can see here the proposed cross section. Things change once we cross the loop, the roadway narrows, and so we would have a 2-way separated bike lane with an adjacent sidewalk. Here the sidewalk is shown on the opposite side of the street. However, in the next phase of design, the sidewalk would shift to the east side of the street where it would be feasible, and then making sure that there's the appropriate crossings. If you'll go to the next slide. You can see here how it shows that 2-way separated bike lane on the east side and then the appropriate transitions to the west side of the street. And again, this is something that would be refined, but not necessarily impacting cost. Really, a few things to consider are access to parking lots, making sure that the businesses and adjacent streets have the appropriate pedestrian access, as well as considering the bridge that is at the Pilgrim's Pride business. If you go to the next slide. The next intersection is Oneida. And here you can see continuing the two-way separated bike lane and sidewalk through this intersection. Most of the changes here are formalizing the crossings, shortening some of the distances, and then ultimately making sure that we have mountable truck aprons that are not only going to reduce turning speeds, but allow for larger vehicles like trucks to make all of the turns that they currently make today. If you go to the next slide. Segment 3 from Oneida to Boulevard, again, has one of the more constrained right-of-way widths. And so you can see the continuation, again, looking at the continuous facility for the two-way separated bike lane moving south, where we have that vertical and horizontal element between the street and the attached sidewalk. If you go to the next slide, you can see some of the treatments for driveway crossings, as well as there will be specific costs associated with updating and coordinating with the railroad to make sure that the crossing of the railroad is safe as well as convenient and doesn't provide a disconnect or a barrier to the two-way separated bike lane or the sidewalk that is proposed. Go to the next slide. The last intersection is for Boulevard. The Boulevard intersection looks a little bit different. The recommendation here is to do a raised intersection, really making sure that this intersection shows a transition, not only into Boulevard, but also that we're raising pedestrians as they cross the street, increasing some of the visibility, as well as making sure that the transitions for this space are, traffic is very slow, along with the three-way stop. This does also connect into the adjacent park, the neighborhood, and makes a great connection between the shared lane markings and sharrows going south to the separated bikeway and separated sidewalk going north. If you go to the next slide. Lastly is segment 4 from Boulevard to Prince. As mentioned previously, the AIM recommendation, it was for the shared lane markings as well as curb extensions to formalize parking as well as increase safety along this corridor. If you'll go to the next slide, you can see here how the curb extensions start to formalize some of that parking space as well as shorten some of the crossing distances along the street. The narrowing of the street can help reduce some of the speed as well as, and so that would make it more comfortable for people that may be traveling by bike in the street before they enter the two-way separated facility. If you go to the next slide. An alternative was reviewed to do a multi-use path along this corridor and still along with the curb extensions. And you can see here, this, although it can be built in the future along with what's proposed in the AIM Commission's recommendation, there are additional impacts that could exist, including impacts to parking, but more specifically to right-of-way as well as drainage. If you go to the next slide, you can see the plan view for that concept. You can also see the additional costs for that specific segment. If you go to the last slide before I hand it to Ronnie, a summary of all of the costs, you can see here that each of the segments are totaled. All of the alternative 1 would align with the AIM Commission's recommendations. And then you can see the additional costs for those alternative 2 components that were outlined previously. Each of the intersection costs stays the same no matter what those alternatives would be. And you can see the totals with the alternative 1, which aligns with the AIM recommendation of a total of around 6.1 million. And then if you added in the elements from alternative 2, the costs being increased to around 7.4, closer to 7.5 million. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ronnie.
Thank you, Jared. Our next steps for Barber Street bike and ped improvement include public engagement. It's scheduled to start on April 28th, including this presentation, and through May 19th. Concept agenda will be reviewed by Athens-Clarke County Mayor and Commission on May 18th. And it ends with concept agenda and for Mayor and Commission scheduled approval on June 1st, 2021. Next slide. Questions and comments. We would love to hear from you. You may view the project story map and the project and provide your feedback by visiting www.accgov.com/barber. or by calling the Transportation and Public Works main office at 706-613-3440, or by email engineering@accc.gov.com. With that, I'll hand it over to Daniel to walk us through the storyboard.
Thanks, Ronnie. Once you click on the story map link, it'll bring you to this page. And you can see over here, we've just got a lot of the information we've talked about today in the presentation shown here in the bar on the left. These colored icons allow you to click on them to zoom in and see what the segment is that we're talking about, as well as skipping ahead to future sections. Or you can either click next or go through the tabs at the top of the page. We've got it divided into project overview, some background information for the project, where you can click on all of these links that we've mentioned today to find out more information. We also have the proposed design tab, which walks you through the full proposed design in an interactive format. So this, once again, is just that concept map, context map that we discussed earlier. You can click on an intersection and it zooms in and shows you what that intersection is going to look like, and you can actually drag around to find your house or business. You can also look at the segments here, and there is some information outlined on the left here, which just walks you through some of the differences between these segments and intersections. Once you click on parcel impacts, this kind of talks about the right-of-way acquisitions a little bit. Ultimately, what this allows you to do is zoom in on that map, and you can actually see home addresses for your parcel or business along the way. And if you click on that parcel, it'll show you the owner name, parcel number, and the acreage. That way you can really see that boundary and how the new plan will affect that parcel. Once you go into cost breakdown, this is set up as a dashboard. Over here on the left, you can see the different segments listed. And then right here, you can see what that total cost is. I do want to note that when you first come to this, this total selected cost will be the estimated cost for all of the alternatives, both the preferred options from Athens and Motion Commission and the additional costs. So if you'd like to see what the preferred alternative is, you can actually click on these icons in the pie chart, and you can kind of build your own. So this right here is what the recommended options would be, and you can kind of build your own version of the plan. Finally, at this last tab, you've got the survey. This is where we really want you guys to come and visit. We'd like to get as much information as you can provide. We talk about how you currently use Barber Street, how frequently you use it, and what modes of transportation you use. We'd also like to know how those options would change based on enhanced bicycle and pedestrian facilities. So if you think your use of this corridor would increase, or if the type of mode of transportation you would use would change, is that going to be affected by us building this project? Finally, we've got these options for the preference of which alternative you personally would like to see. The Athens and Motion recommended alternative is listed in parentheses at the end of each one, and you can select that you don't have a preference or that you would not like to have this section in the project period. You have another option to say that as well below in this project prioritization. Just to pop back up here though, we've got this for segment 1, and then we also have this question again for segment 4. This is Boulevard to Prince Avenue, and the other one is North Chase to the Loop 10 underpass. You can use this map for reference. It shows you the 4 segments just to remind you what we're talking about here. And this is going to be really important for us to find out what order should these get built. like we've said, we do have recommendations from Athens in Motion Commission, and they also want to hear from the public to see if the public is in line with what they are believing. If you have any additional comments, you can note that here, and once you're done, you just click submit. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stephen to close out the presentation.
Thanks, Daniel. And thank you all for sticking with us and participating in this public input process. We're looking forward to getting your survey comments and feedback and incorporating these into our final recommendations for Mayor and Commission. And please keep looking for updates on the ACC Gov website for this and other projects as they all move forward. Thanks again for watching.